Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
There is a strange thing about reading the gospel accounts with fresh and open eyes. When someone grows up inside a religious culture, the stories feel normal because they are told from childhood and repeated again and again. But the moment a person steps back and looks at them the way they would look at any other ancient story, something very different starts to happen. The claims begin to sound less like history and more like exaggerated legends. They begin to look like ideas that grew over time as the early followers tried to make their religious leader look more supernatural and more important. In this video, we will walk through 10 preposterous claims about Jesus in the gospel, and we will look at them with the same common sense that we use for anything else in life. The goal is not to insult anyone, but simply to think clearly. One of the most surprising claims is the idea that Jesus was born of a virgin. When people hear this from childhood, it feels normal. But imagine someone trying to tell the exact same story today. Imagine someone saying that a woman is pregnant even though she has never been with a man, and that this pregnancy is not due to medical technology, but due to a supernatural event. The response in real life would be suspicion and investigation. People would look for biological explanations. Doctors would run tests. No one would simply accept it because someone said it. Yet the gospel writers expect people to believe this without any evidence and without any independent witness. Even more interesting is the fact that the earliest gospel, the one called Mark, does not mention a virgin birth at all. The story enters the tradition later, which suggests that it developed over time in order to give Jesus a divine origin story. When stories grow and evolve in this way, it usually means they are not based on fact, but on later imagination. Another strange claim in the Gospels is that Jesus could walk on water. This is not told as a symbolic parable. It is presented as a literal event. But think for a moment about how people behave when they witness something that breaks the laws of physics. They talk about it for years. They write about it in journals. They try to explain it. They do research. Even today, if someone recorded a person walking on water with a clear video, it would become the most studied footage ever captured. Scientists from all over the world would examine it. Yet in the ancient world, we have no such independent record. Only the gospel writer offers this story, and he does not give the date, the place, or the testimony of the other people who were supposedly in the boat. It looks more like a dramatic scene added to show the power of the hero. Every ancient religion has such scenes. In Greek stories, the gods walk on water or control storms. In Hindu tales, divine figures float above the rivers. When a pattern appears across cultures, it often reveals that the story is not historical, but symbolic or legendary. Then there is the claim that Jesus multiplied food for thousands of people. Again, the story is told as literal history. But think about how humans behave when someone can produce unlimited food. In real life, such a person would become the most important figure in society. Governments would send representatives. Kings would try to meet him. Hunger would end forever. Yet after this supposed miracle, nothing changes in the world. The people in the story go back to being hungry. The Roman Empire continues to oppress the poor. No one outside the gospel record ever mentions a mass miracle of this scale. If thousands of people saw free food appear out of thin air, the story would spread through the entire region like wildfire. Yet it leaves no trace in any independent historical source. This is a very strong signal that the story was created in order to teach a message about generosity rather than record an actual event. Another very large claim is that Jesus healed people instantly by touch or by spoken words. In the ancient world, healing stories were common. Many religious leaders were said to heal the blind or cure diseases with nothing more than a gesture. Even today, there are many faith healers who make the same claims. But when medical professionals test those claims, they never hold up under proper observation. No one ever recovers from blindness, paralysis, or missing limbs through prayer alone. The results are always temporary emotional responses or natural healing processes that are exaggerated. When we apply the same logic to the gospel healing stories, we see the same pattern. No medical examination, no names of doctors, no proof of before and after. The stories are written in a way that fits the expectations of ancient readers, not modern historical investigation. The healings look more like symbolic narratives designed to show moral ideas. They show compassion, hope, and spiritual meaning, not medical facts. One of the most preposterous claims about Jesus is the idea that he cursed a fig tree because it did not have fruit, even though it was not the season for fruit. This story is often overlooked, but it raises serious questions. If Jesus had divine knowledge, then he would know that the tree could not have fruit during that time of year. If he had supernatural power, he could simply make fruit appear. Yet the Gospel tells us that he cursed the tree and made it wither. This looks more like a symbolic story created by the Gospel writer to make a point about Israel or faith, rather than something that happened. It shows frustration, impatience, and a lack of understanding of nature. It does not show the behavior of an all-knowing divine being. When a story contradicts the basic logic of nature, it is usually a sign that the event did not happen. Another major claim is that Jesus was transfigured on a mountain, glowing like light while two figures from the past suddenly appeared beside him. This claim is extremely extraordinary. It suggests time travel, supernatural transformation, and communication between the living and the dead. If such an event happened in the real world, the entire region would know about it. People would build monuments, travelers would write about it, philosophers would debate it. Yet outside of the Gospel, no one ever mentions such an event. Also, the disciples who supposedly witnessed it were asleep before it happened. This is a pattern often found in dreams and visions. People see something after waking from sleep and interpret it as real. The story follows the same pattern found in many ancient myths where a hero meets figures from the past and shines with divine light. Stories like that are almost always symbolic and not historical. Another very bold claim in the Gospels is that Jesus cast demons into a herd of pigs, and the pigs then ran into a lake and drowned. This story reveals a lot about the ancient worldview. People in that time believed that mental illness or unusual behavior was caused by spirits or demons. Today we know that such conditions have natural causes. Psychology, neurology, and medicine explain behavior in ways that do not require supernatural beings. The idea of demons entering animals and forcing them to run to their death sounds exactly like the superstition of that era. If someone today told you that a demon left a person, entered a group of animals, and made them kill themselves, it would be treated as a fictional story or the product of imagination. The fact that this story appears only in the Gospel and nowhere else in history makes it even more doubtful. A mass death of animals would attract attention from farmers, traders, and officials, yet there is no such record. Another unusual claim is the idea that Jesus predicted the end of the world within the lifetime of his listeners. The Gospel has Jesus saying that some of the people standing with him will not die before the world changes dramatically. But thousands of years have passed, and the world continues. This is not a small mistake. It shows that either Jesus was wrong or the Gospel writers misunderstood him, or someone later added those words. If a modern teacher predicted the end of the world within a few decades and it did not happen, people would stop believing him. But because this prediction comes from a religious text, people excuse it or reinterpret it. When a prophecy fails, the honest conclusion is that the prophecy was not true. This raises serious questions about the reliability of the text. Another bold claim is that Jesus rose from the dead. This is the central claim of Christianity, yet it has the least evidence. All accounts come from followers who already believed or wanted to believe. There is no neutral witness. No Roman official wrote about it. No historian in the region recorded it. The tomb is not verified. The timing is unclear. And most importantly, the earliest writings of Paul speak of the resurrection in spiritual terms, not physical terms. He talks about visions and appearances, not a physical body walking out of a grave. The fact that later gospel writers add more details shows the growth of legend. In real life, when someone dies, the body decays. It does not come back to life after 3 days. Every piece of medical knowledge confirms this. Stories of resurrection exist in many cultures, which shows that humans naturally create such stories about revered leaders. Another extraordinary claim is that Jesus ascended into the sky in front of his followers. If someone today rose into the sky, every person would record it. There would be video footage, news coverage, scientific investigation. It would change the world forever. Yet the gospel account is extremely short and vague. Only one gospel describes it clearly. Others do not mention it. This inconsistency shows that the story probably developed later. The idea of a hero rising to the heavens appears. When we take all of these extraordinary claims as a whole, something even more interesting appears. The gospel does not read like a historical report. It reads like a collection of stories created in a time when people believed in magic, spirits, omens, and supernatural events. Humans at that time did not have modern science. They did not know how diseases work. They did not have access to psychology or physics or biology. They explained everything through supernatural ideas because that was the best they could do with the knowledge they had. When someone fell ill, they believed it was a spirit. When someone behaved strangely, they believed it was a demon. When lightning struck, they believed the gods were angry. In that kind of world, stories about walking on water, multiplying food, or rising from the dead were not questioned. They were accepted because the culture already expected such things to happen. When we understand this, the gospel looks less like a record of events and more like a reflection of ancient thinking. Another point that shows the legendary nature of these claims is the silence of other historians from that time. There were many writers living in the region during the supposed lifetime of Jesus. There were Roman officials, Jewish scholars, philosophers, and historians. They wrote about wars, political events, and unusual happenings. But none of them wrote about a man who healed the blind, fed thousands with a few pieces of bread, performed supernatural acts, and rose from the dead. If even a small part of the gospel stories were true in a literal sense, then the entire region would have been talking about it. People would record it, authorities would investigate it, but the historical record is empty. The only place these stories appear is within the religious writings of the followers themselves. This is exactly what we see in other religions as well. The supernatural stories appear only in the holy text, not in the independent historical record. Think about how news travels in the real world. Imagine someone in a small town today performing a miracle that breaks the laws of nature. Even if the miracle is small, the internet would explode with attention. People would share videos, journalists would report it, and scientists would analyze it. Even before the internet, newspapers would write about it, and witnesses would describe what they saw. But in the case of the Gospels, we have none of this. The events described are massive, world-changing, and supernatural. Thousands of people witness food appearing out of thin air. A man walks on top of the sea. A dead man comes back to life. Yet nobody outside the small group of followers ever mentions it. This is a very strong sign that the stories were not based on real events. Another problem is the way the gospel writers contradict one another. If several people witness the same event, their accounts may differ in small ways, but they will agree on the main facts. In the Gospels, however, the core details often change. The genealogy of Jesus is different in two Gospels. The words on the cross are different. The order of events is different. The resurrection stories are very different. In some accounts, the women see angels. In another account, they see a man. In one story, Jesus appears in Galilee. In another story, he appears in Jerusalem. When stories evolve like this, it usually means the writers were working with tradition rather than memory. It shows that the story was shaped by community beliefs, not eyewitness reports. One more point that often goes unnoticed is the long gap between the events and the writing of the Gospels. The earliest Gospel, the one called Mark, was written around 40 years after the supposed death of Jesus. The others were written even later. In real life, memories fade very quickly. People misremember events. They fill in gaps with imagination. They exaggerate. They try to fit events into meaningful patterns. When 4 decades pass between an event and its recording, accuracy becomes very unlikely. And when the people telling the story already believe the main character is divine, the exaggeration becomes even stronger. This is how legends grow. A simple teacher becomes a miracle worker. A healer becomes a divine figure. A leader who died becomes a hero who rose into the sky. There is also the issue of cultural borrowing. Many of the stories about Jesus match older traditions from neighboring cultures. For example, many ancient religions have stories about gods born in unusual ways. Many have miracle workers who heal the sick. Many have figures who rise from the dead or return in visions. The gospel stories do not appear in a vacuum. They fit into a long line of mythological traditions that were already well known in that region. When stories follow older patterns, it often means the writers were influenced by what they had heard and believed. They shaped the story of Jesus to fit the expectations of the people around them. This is how myths are created. They take the structure of earlier myths and apply it to a new character. A good example is the resurrection story. In the ancient world, resurrection stories were very common. The Egyptians had Osiris. The Greeks had Dionysus. The Persians had Mithras in some versions of the tradition. These stories all involve a dying and rising figure who represents hope, renewal, or spiritual truth. When the earliest Christians began to honor Jesus, they naturally used the language and symbolism already present in their culture. They shaped his story to match what people already understood. This does not make these early believers dishonest. It simply shows how human storytelling works. People tell stories in a way that fits their worldview. Another powerful example is the story of walking on water. In the ancient world, the sea was a symbol of chaos. Many ancient mythologies include stories of gods or heroes standing above water to show dominance over chaos. It is a symbolic image, not a historical event. The Gospel writer used this symbol to show that Jesus had authority in a spiritual sense. The problem is that later readers take it literally and assume it is a factual report. But when we view it with understanding of ancient symbolism, it becomes clear that it is a piece of religious literature, not a description of physics. There is also the problem of geographic and historical errors in the Gospel. For example, some stories describe events that cannot be verified because the locations do not exist in history the way the Gospel describes them. Some towns are placed in the wrong regions. Some customs are described inaccurately. When a writer tells a historical story, small mistakes like this usually indicate that the writer was not an eyewitness. The Gospel writers lived far from the events, wrote long after the events, and relied on oral tradition rather than personal experience. When we look at these stories with that in mind, the supernatural claims become even harder to believe. Another important point is that people even today continue to believe in supernatural events when they want to. When someone really wants to believe something, the mind becomes very powerful at convincing itself. People see what they want to see. They interpret coincidences as miracles. They misremember ordinary events as extraordinary. This does not mean they are lying, it means they are human. Early followers of Jesus were deeply emotional after his death. They were grieving. They were afraid. They wanted to believe that their teacher had not been defeated. In moments of grief, people often see visions, dreams, or powerful feelings that they interpret as contact with a loved one. This happens all over the world even today. Many people believe they feel or see someone who died recently. The early Christians may have had similar experiences and interpreted them as resurrection appearances. Over time, the stories grew and became more detailed. By the time the Gospel writers wrote them down, they had already transformed into supernatural narratives. When we put all of this together, the pattern becomes clear. The claims in the Gospel are not the kind of claims that come from careful historical investigation. They are the kind of claims that come from ancient storytelling, symbolic imagination, cultural borrowing, emotional experiences, and legendary growth. They reflect the beliefs of ancient people, not the laws of nature. And when we examine these stories with honest reason, we find that they collapse under the weight of their own exaggeration. The goal of examining these preposterous claims is not to attack anyone. It is to encourage clear thinking. When someone reads the Gospel without fear and without pressure, they begin to see it for what it is. It is not a history book. It is not a scientific report. It is a collection of ancient stories written by people who lived in a very different time. They used the language of miracles and supernatural events to express their reverence for their teacher. But reverence does not equal fact. Real truth does not require supernatural claims. It stands on evidence, logic, reason, and honesty. When we evaluate the Gospel with these tools, we see that many of the claims about Jesus are not just unlikely. They are completely outside the realm of the possible. They belong to the world of legend, not the world of reality. If humans want to understand the real world, then we must use real methods. We must question extraordinary claims. We must ask for evidence. We must use the same standards for all stories, whether they come from one religion or another. When we do this, we see clearly that the Gospel contains many beautiful ideas, but it does not contain reliable history. The preposterous claims about Jesus reflect the human imagination, not the laws of nature.